What if the next big blow in the Middle East is not a missile, not a drone, and not a surprise attack? What if it is a political move so smart that Israel wakes up one day and realizes the battlefield is no longer the place where this fight is being decided? Before we go deeper, do this with me. Tap like if you want analysis that goes past the headlines, subscribe if you are tired of shallow talking points, and share this video with one friend who always says there has to be more going on here, because that may be exactly where this story is headed. And if that happens, the map of power in the region may change without a single new front line being drawn. For weeks, most people have been watching the same things: airstrikes, missile launches, intercepts in the sky, emergency meetings, angry speeches, ceasefire rumors, then more threats, then another round of fear. That is normal. War pulls your eyes toward fire. It makes you believe the loudest moment is the most important moment. But history keeps teaching the same lesson. The loudest moment is not always the most important one. Sometimes the future is decided in quieter rooms, by colder minds, after the cameras move on. That is why the real question may not be who hit harder. It may not be who looked stronger on one terrible night. The real question is this: after all this destruction, who is better positioned to shape what comes next? And that question matters because military power and political power are not the same thing. A country can win exchanges and still lose influence. A country can absorb damage and still improve its position. A government can look cornered in public and still be planning 3 moves ahead in private. That is the part many viewers miss when they watch this region like a scorecard. They count explosions and assume they are counting power. But power is more than firepower. Power is also access. Power is also diplomacy. Power is also the ability to make other countries say, "We may not trust you, but we have to deal with you." That may be where Iran sees an opening, not because all its problems are gone, not because sanctions vanished, not because its economy is suddenly healthy, and not because Israel stopped being militarily dominant. None of that is true, but this moment may still offer Tehran something valuable, a chance to slowly weaken the wall of isolation built around it for decades. And if that wall starts to crack, even a little, Israel faces a harder problem than another rocket attack, because rockets can be intercepted. Diplomatic drift is much harder to stop. Think about the larger setting. The Middle East is not frozen in the old pattern anymore. 20 years ago, many regional choices were easier to predict. Friend and enemy lines looked more fixed. Public rhetoric was louder. Governments were more trapped by older blocs and older habits. Today, things are different. Gulf states are thinking about investment, shipping, tourism, technology, and energy plans that stretch 10 or 20 years into the future. Turkey is pursuing its own path. China wants trade routes and stability. Russia still wants relevance. The United States is still the strongest outside player, but it is also stretched across multiple crises around the world. In that kind of environment, nobody wants endless chaos if it can be avoided. Not because governments have become moral, not because old rivalries disappeared, but because instability is expensive. It scares investors, it shakes energy prices, it raises insurance costs, it threatens shipping lanes. It makes long-term planning harder. It can turn one regional clash into a global economic headache in days. That changes how leaders think. A government that dislikes Iran may still decide that permanent confrontation is too costly. A government that does not trust Israel's current direction may also fear open war. A government that depends on trade may look at every new crisis and think, "We need a way to calm this down before it spreads." That is where strategy gets interesting, because when enough countries begin asking how to reduce escalation, the country that can present itself as necessary to stability gains leverage, not moral victory, leverage. And leverage in hard politics can matter more. Iran understands pressure better than most states. For years it has lived under sanctions, covert pressure, military threats, and diplomatic limits. That does not make it invincible. It does not make it wise in every decision. But it does mean Iranian leaders are used to thinking in long games. When direct strength is limited, you look for indirect gains. When you cannot break a system head on, you try to bend it. When you cannot force acceptance, you make yourself harder to exclude. That may be the real objective now. Not a grand cinematic victory, not a flag planted on a hill, something quieter, something colder, something more durable. To move from being treated only as a problem to being treated as a factor nobody can ignore. And here is why that matters for Israel. Israel's core strength is real. Its military reach is real. Its intelligence system is real. Its alliance with Washington is still powerful. But even very strong states depend on the political environment around them. They need partners. They need room to operate. They need others to share their sense of urgency. They need the world, or at least enough of the world, to keep seeing the same threat picture. What happens if that picture starts to blur? What happens if more capitals begin saying, yes, Iran is dangerous, but isolation is no longer working? What happens if they decide engagement is cheaper than endless escalation? What happens if Washington starts asking not only how to defend Israel, but how to prevent the entire region from becoming a permanent drain on American attention and resources? That is when the danger of isolation changes shape. It stops looking like a military encirclement and starts looking like political loneliness. And political loneliness can sneak up on a state slowly, one meeting at a time, one trade deal at a time, one diplomatic channel at a time, one shift in language at a time. Look at how regional powers are thinking now. Saudi Arabia wants security, but it also wants transformation at home. The UAE wants business, access, and room to maneuver. Qatar wants influence through mediation. Turkey wants autonomy. Egypt wants stability on its borders. Jordan wants survival in a dangerous neighborhood. Iraq does not want to become a battlefield again. Even Europe, far away, worries about energy shocks, refugee pressure, and wider instability. These actors do not agree on everything, far from it. But many of them do agree on one point: another giant regional war would be a disaster. That means diplomacy is no longer a sideshow. It becomes part of the fight itself. And here is the deeper point. Diplomacy is not only about reaching a final agreement. Sometimes the process is the win. Sometimes just opening doors matters. Sometimes being invited matters. Sometimes getting others used to dealing with you matters. Sometimes making rivals look inflexible while you look available matters. In international politics, perception can open paths that force alone cannot. That is why the next phase may be more dangerous for Israel than the last phase was dramatic. Because the last phase was visible, the next phase may be subtle. It may happen through restored talks, back-channel messages, regional mediation, maritime arrangements, energy discussions, prisoner deals, or limited understandings that do not look historic in the moment. But when enough small moves add up, they can create a new reality, and Israel may find itself facing a question it cannot answer with air power alone. How do you stop rival states from becoming more diplomatically useful to others? How do you stop war fatigue from changing the calculations of your own partners? How do you keep your coalition strong when every new crisis makes neutral players crave stability more than confrontation? Those are not easy questions, and they matter now because Gaza changed the emotional climate of this conflict. Whether people agree or disagree on every detail, the war's images reached every screen on Earth. Public pressure rose in many countries. Anger rose, unease rose. Political leaders noticed, allies noticed, neutral countries noticed. Global audiences that once saw the region through a narrow security frame now see a wider moral and political crisis. That does not erase the threat Israel faces from armed groups or hostile states, but it does make it harder to keep the old diplomatic balance untouched. If this breakdown is helping you see the story in a different way, here is your second mission. Drop a comment with the one country you think holds the hidden key in this crisis. Subscribe before you forget, and send this video to someone who still thinks geopolitics is only about armies and maps. Because we are now entering the part of the story where narratives, economics, and timing start shaping outcomes as much as weapons do. And that is exactly where patient states try to turn pain into position.
Now, let us go even deeper. A lot of analysts talk about deterrence as if it ends the discussion. Either deterrence worked or it failed. Either one side was scared or it was not. But real deterrence is rarely that simple. In a long conflict, every actor is trying to send messages to several audiences at once. One message goes to the enemy, another goes to allies, another goes to domestic supporters, another goes to undecided states watching from the side. That means an action can look costly in one direction, but useful in another. Iran's leadership likely understands that it does not need to dominate the region militarily to improve its strategic position. It may only need to prove three things. First, that it cannot be ignored. Second, that attempts to isolate it forever come with rising costs. Third, that any future regional order built without it will be unstable.
If enough governments start believing those 3 points, Iran gains something it has wanted for a long time: relevance that cannot easily be denied. And relevance, once normalized, becomes bargaining power. This is where the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. It is not just a waterway on a map. It is a pressure valve for the global economy. A huge share of the world's energy trade moves through that narrow space. Every insurance company, every shipping network, every major energy importer, and every finance ministry understands what even the threat of disruption can do. Prices jump, markets shake, governments make calls they were not planning to make. That does not mean Iran wants to shut it down in some reckless move. That would be dangerous for everyone, including Iran. But the very fact that it sits beside such a critical route gives it a permanent form of relevance. Geography becomes leverage when the world cannot ignore what happens near your shores. Now connect that to diplomacy. If Iran can position itself as necessary to any serious conversation about maritime stability, regional de-escalation, or energy security, then it stops being only a target of policy and becomes a participant in shaping policy. That is a huge difference, and it is exactly the kind of shift that could leave Israel uncomfortable. Why? Because Israel has spent years working inside a regional environment where containing Iran was a shared goal for many players. The strength of that framework was not only military, it was political. It rested on a broad sense that pressure on Iran should continue, that normalization with Israel could grow, and that Tehran would remain boxed in. But frameworks are fragile. They survive only as long as enough players believe they still serve their interests. The moment interests start changing, even slightly, the framework starts wobbling. And when leaders begin asking whether the old model is producing more danger than stability, new thinking enters the room. That does not mean these countries suddenly trust Iran. They do not. That does not mean they abandon ties with Israel. Most will not. That does not mean America walks away. It almost certainly will not. What it does mean is that more governments may begin hedging. They may keep one foot in the old system while quietly opening doors to a different future. Hedging is one of the most important ideas in modern geopolitics. It means states avoid betting everything on one outcome. They spread risk. They keep options alive. They talk to rivals while staying close to partners. They build backup plans. And in a region as unstable as the Middle East, hedging is not weakness, it is survival. So ask yourself this: if Gulf capitals hedge, if Turkey hedges, if Washington itself becomes more focused on managing escalation than maximizing confrontation, then what happens to Israel's strategic comfort zone? It shrinks. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. And here is where this story becomes especially uncomfortable. Military superiority can create confidence, sometimes too much confidence. A state that knows it can hit harder, see deeper, and move faster may start assuming the political environment will keep adjusting around its military logic. But the political environment has its own logic. Other states have their own fears, their own voters, their own business elites, their own security calculations, their own red lines. If those actors start seeing endless escalation as a threat to themselves, they will search for alternatives. They may not love those alternatives. They may not fully trust them, but they will still search. And every search for an alternative weakens the old consensus a little more. This is also where the United States becomes central. Washington remains Israel's most important backer. That is not changing tomorrow, but American strategy is wider than one country and wider than one war. The United States is dealing with China, Russia, Europe, domestic political division, debt pressure, industrial competition, and global military commitments that stretch across several theaters. In that context, every Middle East crisis is judged through a hard question. What is the cost of letting this expand? If the answer looks too expensive, then American officials start looking for ways to contain, cool, or redirect the crisis. Not because they suddenly agree with Iran, Because empire-level planning is about priorities, and priorities force trade-offs. That is why Israel cannot think only in military terms. Even if it remains the strongest military actor in its immediate environment, it still depends on a wider political ecosystem. If that ecosystem starts rewarding de-escalation, regional diplomacy, and controlled engagement, then Israeli leaders face pressure from a direction they cannot bomb away. They face pressure from changing interests. And changing interests are among the hardest forces in the world to reverse. History is full of examples where states stayed tactically strong while their strategic environment became less friendly, not because they got weaker in absolute terms, but because others began adjusting around them. Allies re-ranked their priorities. Neutral states became more active. Outside powers demanded restraint. Trade networks reshaped incentives. Public opinion raised the domestic cost of alignment. None of this happens in one dramatic moment. It happens drip by drip until the old landscape is gone. That is the warning inside this title. Iran's next move may not leave Israel isolated in a total or permanent sense, but it could leave Israel more isolated than before, more alone in defining the crisis, more alone in pushing escalation, more alone in insisting that pressure must keep rising. And in strategy, even relative isolation can matter a lot, because once a country is no longer setting the tone, it starts reacting to a conversation shaped by others, and reaction is a weaker position than initiative. Now imagine the next 6 to 12 months. No giant peace deal, no miracle breakthrough, just a string of careful moves, more indirect talks, more mediation, more pressure from regional states to avoid another explosion, more global concern about shipping and energy, more American focus on preventing a wider war, and more governments quietly deciding that some level of engagement with Iran is safer than permanent confrontation. That is how strategic isolation weakens, not with a dramatic announcement, with normalization by degree, with familiarity, with repeated contact, with practical needs overriding ideological dislike. One meeting does not change history, but 50 meetings can. One channel does not transform a region, but a network of channels can. If Iran plays this well, it does not need everyone to love it. It does not even need most governments to trust it. It only needs enough actors to conclude that excluding Iran is no longer realistic, useful, or cheap. That alone would be a serious shift. And what would that mean for Israel? It would mean the challenge ahead becomes broader than deterrence. It becomes a contest over legitimacy, flexibility, and coalition management. Israel would have to persuade partners not only that Iran is dangerous, but that continued hard isolation remains the best path despite the costs, despite the pressure, and despite the region's growing hunger for stability. That is a harder argument to win in a tired world, especially if the war in Gaza continues shaping global opinion, especially if humanitarian anger keeps colliding with security arguments, especially if Arab governments feel rising public pressure from below while trying to manage security risks from above, especially if Washington wants fewer fires, not more. Every one of those forces pulls against a simple military approach. Quick pause before the last turn. If this video is giving you a clearer map of the crisis, save your spot with a like, subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive, and share this with the friend who always asks, okay, but what happens next? This does not mean Iran is guaranteed success. Far from it. Iran has its own weaknesses, internal strains, economic pain, public dissatisfaction, and serious enemies. Its leadership can miscalculate, it can overreach, it can scare potential partners, it can turn opportunity into backlash. Strategy offers chances, not certainty, but the chance is real. And serious analysts pay attention to chances before they become realities. That is why this moment matters. Because the region may be entering a transitional phase where the winners are not the ones who fired last, but the ones who best understand what everyone else fears most. And what does everyone fear most right now? A war that never ends, a region that never stabilizes, a shipping lane that snaps, an energy market that spirals, a public anger that spreads, an ally that drags others into wider confrontation, a crisis that keeps multiplying until no capital can control it. The state that learns to speak to those fears gains room. The state that looks like it can help calm them gains relevance. The state that seems locked into perpetual escalation risks losing diplomatic ground, even if it remains militarily strong. That is the paradox. Strength can protect you, but if others start seeing your strategy as part of the instability they fear, your strength can stop translating into influence the way it once did. And that may be the biggest risk Israel faces in the next chapter. So when people ask, did the last exchange settle anything? The answer is probably no. It may have only moved the contest into a more complex arena, a quieter one, a slower one, but in many ways a more decisive one. Because wars end, but the political order left behind can last for years. And if Iran's next move is aimed not at winning a battle, but at weakening the habit of isolating it, then the consequences could reach far beyond Iran and Israel. They could reshape how the whole region chooses partners, defines threats, and imagines stability. That is why this story deserves more than headline reactions. It deserves patience, it deserves context, and above all, it deserves one final question. What if the next real victory in this conflict does not belong to the side with the stronger strike package, but to the side that convinces the region it is too important to leave outside the room? If that happens, Israel will still be strong, it will still be armed, it will still matter. But it may find that strength alone is no longer enough to keep the region aligned the way it once was. And that is how isolation begins in modern geopolitics. Not with a dramatic abandonment, with a gradual rearranging of incentives, with partners pursuing options, with rivals gaining access, with the center of gravity shifting quietly until everyone suddenly notices the balance has changed. And by then, the next move will already have worked, long before most people on television even realize the game has changed.